Good evening and welcome, everyone. It's great to see such a nice crowd here with us, including many people new to the Federation. My particularly deep welcome to all of you. My name is Andrew Kushner, and I'm Executive Vice President for Donor Relations at the Federation. We're thrilled to have Spencer Rascoff and Jackie Karsh here for our program. But before we start talking about disruption in the tech space, I want to tell you about how the Federation has responded to the disruption caused by COVID-19 and the foundational challenges it has presented to the Jewish community. Our Federation always identifies and addresses our community's most significant challenges and opportunities. In response to the pandemic, the Federation helped our community through a series of quick, strategic, and large-scale efforts that cared for those in need, supported families to help them stay connected to Jewish life, and secured our important community institutions. Our efforts included ensuring that the elderly and most vulnerable in our community, including our cherished Holocaust survivors, have had what they've needed to continue to live with dignity. We've kept our community safe as we've seen an alarming rise in anti-Semitism across the country through our Community Security Initiative. And when we learned through our outreach and analysis that a surprisingly large number of college students and Jewish young adults were struggling to afford food, we created a new program called Well Fed that provided them with grocery cards and social services. So far, we have reached over 1,000 participants in that program. We're also well prepared to lead the community through the next phase, as all of our community members and our community institutions struggle through these challenging times. We're able to do this work through the support of our donors, many of whom come from our 6 professional networks that are participating in this evening's session. We're placing a link of information about those networks into the chat. Please click through and reach out to us and let us know how you want to get involved. And for those of you who are new, as I said, we are particularly eager to provide concierge services to welcome you to our Federation family. There's never been a more important time for the business community to stand with the Federation as we put our arms around our precious Jewish community. I also want to acknowledge this evening and thank the presenting sponsor of all of our professional networks, City National Bank, the co-chairs of our Finance and Business Professionals Network, Jolie Alshul and Aaron Cohen, the Finance and Business and JTech committees, and the benefactor and visionary and my good friend behind our JTech network, Stephen Nichols. And now I'm pleased to hand the program over to Aaron Cohen, who, as I mentioned, is one of our F&B co-chairs. He's also an executive vice president in City National Bank's specialty banking division. Aaron, take it away.
Thanks, Andrew. We appreciate very much you giving us an update on the Federation's important work. It's great to be able to welcome 2 friends tonight for our main event. Spencer Rascoff is an accomplished entrepreneur and company leader who co-founded Zillow, Hotwire, .la, and Picasso, and who served as Zillow's CEO for a decade. During Spencer's time as CEO, Zillow won dozens of Best Places to Work awards as it grew to over 4,500 employees, $3 billion in revenue, and $20 billion in market capitalization. Prior to Zillow, Spencer was co-founder and VP corporate development of Hotwire, which was sold to Expedia for $685 million in 2003. Spencer is now active as an angel investor in over 50 startups and is starting new companies through his Los Angeles startup studio, 75 and Sunny, including .la, a new site covering the Los Angeles tech scene, and Picasso, a real estate platform that makes second home ownership more accessible through co-ownership and recently reached unicorn status. He's also an author, former visiting professor at Harvard Business School, podcast host, and dad, so there isn't much he can't do. Spence will be joined in conversation with Jackie Karsh, a 2-time Emmy-nominated multimedia journalist covering Los Angeles County for LA 36's LA County channel. Jackie reports on social and humanitarian issues impacting Angelenos. Her pieces range from stories on the county-wide homelessness crisis, social welfare, political developments, prison reform, transformative infrastructure, and community projects. She's interviewed major newsmakers and thought leaders. In addition to serving on the board of directors for the Columbia University Alumni Association of Southern California and Columbia College Women, she's a board member of the Jewish Federation and is currently a participant in the Rautenberg New Leaders Project through the Federation. So let's get started. Spencer and Jackie, welcome.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks, Aaron.
I want to add one more note about Spencer, though. So I actually discovered that Spencer was a pretty serious chess player, even ranked one of the top 5 chess players in the country when he was under 12 years old. Spencer, if I'm not mistaken, you attribute some of your business strategy to lessons you learned from competitive chess playing. So after you hear a bio like that, I have to ask, should we all be shoring up our chess game?
Chess is a great skill to learn at an early age. I made my kids learn, I just think it teaches concentration, it teaches competition, it teaches how to win, how to lose. So yeah, I do think we should all be working on our chess game. I used to be a much better chess player than I am today. Unfortunately, I've lost most of my chess skills, but it was formative for sure.
But you kept the lessons. So you didn't set out to work in tech. You even dabbled in journalism, graduated from Harvard, went on to work in Goldman Sachs and mergers and acquisitions. Then you moved to San Francisco to work at the Texas Pacific Group in private equity. You end up leaving TPG at the tender age of 23 to start Hotwire, a discount travel site. Can you take us back to that time in your life? What prompted you to leave a relatively stable job? And how did you know it was the right time to start something new? Were your parents and friends like, hey, you're crazy?
Yeah, I mean, every time I've left a role, whether it was when I left Goldman Sachs to go to TPG, or when I left TPG to start Hotwire, or when I retired from Zillow, it was at least partly due to a conversation that I've had with my wife, who is the most important person in my life by far. And she, in each of those cases, was able to tell me that I was unhappy even before I knew I was. So when I left private equity in 1999 to do a startup, it was the beginning of the internet boom. I was in San Francisco, technology was taking off, and it seemed clear that this wave of tech innovation was going to change the world, and I wanted to be a part of it. And it was she that encouraged me to have the gumption to do so. And it seemed like a good idea initially in 1999, and then in 2001, when both the tech bubble burst and the travel bubble burst after 9/11, it didn't seem that smart. And I was wondering why I left Wall Street and why I left private equity to do a startup. But through it, it was again another very formative experience that allowed me to gain so much at such an early age that I wouldn't have traded it for anything.
I think a lot of the wives on here on this little Zoom are very appreciative of your comments, and the husbands might want to think twice next time their wife tells them something. I'm hoping my husband's listening. 7 years after selling Hotwire to Expedia in a massive deal, you launched Zillow. That explodes in IPOs. Now, fast forward to today, you have 75 and Sunny, which is your venture and startup lab. And you have plans to start 3 to 5 companies per year. What are the biggest differences between company building now as a seasoned entrepreneur versus your 23-year-old self? Has your strategy totally evolved? Has the game changed?
The game has definitely changed. First of all, it is so much easier to start a company today than ever before. I mean, the technology that is available to you, the infrastructure, the funding environment, everything is completely different. Just to give you an example, when we started Hotwire in 1999, it's about $10 million for us to launch the first version of the website. And it took over a year. And we had to hire consultants to do so. We had to build our own data center with our own servers. Fast forward 20 years to today, startups are launching with 1 or 2 employees, maybe offshore. There's a well-built out infrastructure for offshore development now. They're using services like Amazon Web Services. So they're using cloud computing. They don't no longer need to build out their own tech infrastructure. They can use open source software tools. I mean, it's radically different. And that makes it a great time to be an entrepreneur. It's easier than ever to start companies. That's at a high level. That's the sort of external differences. The internal differences for me are that I know a lot more now than I did then, and my network is much more built out. So when I have an idea that I want to pursue, or when a founder pitches me on an idea, I'm much better able to tap my network of people that I've worked with in the past to form an opinion about that idea and or to get it started which I wasn't able to do 10 or 20 years ago.
Most people don't really rev up after they've had the kind of success that you have had. So what motivates you to keep building?
I'm a curious person. I mean, when I left Zillow, I retired for like 5 minutes and it didn't stick. I found myself antsy and I wanted to keep building and I wanted to keep learning and keep trying new things. I also like working with other people, and all of the startups that I've done, from Picasso to .la to Zillow or Hotwire or whatever, it's always been about surrounding myself with a great team of people that are passionate and motivated about solving some big problem. And I draw on that energy from others. And that's what keeps me going. I mean, I'm not, I don't know, maybe someday I will want to pursue a different path, but for now, I still have a lot left I want to accomplish and do interesting things with people whom I like working with.
So you mentioned building a team. You seem to do everything, but you can't, right? So how do you build a team? What's your formula? I feel like everyone has their specific formula for how they surround themselves with the right people. What's yours?
Well, it's very hard to build a team, and it's very hard to do it at a high growth company, because what makes somebody very well qualified for a particular role at one point in time might no longer be the case as the company scales. And that's particularly difficult when you start companies with friends, because you can frequently find yourself in a situation where a person that was the head of sales when you had 10 employees is no longer the right person to be head of sales when you have 100 employees, or a software engineer who was a great individual contributor. And all of a sudden, as the company grows, they're overseeing a team of 40 and they're no longer a great engineering manager, but they were a great individual contributor. It can be difficult to deal with those types of changes as companies scale. So, that's the least fun part of management and of startups, is being hardcore about performance management and making sure that you have the right people for the challenges that lie ahead. But on a more pleasant note, just thinking about recruiting and team building, it starts with having a big idea, having a big mission, something that people can get excited about and fired up about joining, and being part of something bigger than themselves. So I always try to cast whatever I'm doing as part of a mission orientation. If it's .la, it's not just a news website, it's trying to lift up the entire LA tech ecosystem through journalism. And if .la is successful, then all of LA tech will be more successful. And therefore, if you're a reporter that I'm recruiting, like maybe Jackie, I'll recruit you someday to .la, I'm trying to convince you that if you join, you can have this huge impact, right? You not just be a reporter, but and do the work of reporting, but actually have a broader impact than yourself. So casting a startup as something bigger that people can get excited about is an important part of team building and recruiting.
Okay, so that really leads me to my next question, which is all about corporate culture. You've been rated a top CEO. Your companies are, on the top lists of places to work for. What about corporate culture is so important to you?
Well, I mean, most companies now have realized the importance of this. I mean, so it's no longer a strategic advantage the way I think it used to be. I mean, I was focused on building company culture long before it was a thing. Most people have come on board now. I don't know. I'll tell you a quick story on this topic. So I was at a dinner in Seattle, probably 10 years or so ago, of all the CEOs of the big Seattle tech companies, and Expedia and Microsoft and Zillow and five to 10 other companies. And the topic of the dinner, the reason we convened the dinner, was to talk about all of these San Francisco Bay Area companies that were opening engineering offices and sales offices and other offices in Seattle and stealing all our people. So the Seattle tech CEOs got together to talk about, what can we do to fight back and make sure that we retain the best people. Zillow was headquartered in Seattle, and that's where I lived at the time. And we spent the first hour of this dinner talking about ways to recruit better and compensation practices and all of these, all these ways to try to recruit and retain great people. And Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, he commands the attention of the room because he's the CEO of Microsoft. And he says, I think this whole conversation has been off base. You're all totally missing the point. And everyone's kind of like, oh, okay. And he says, this is not a recruiting problem. This is an employee engagement problem. If I can just get I think he had at the time 200,000 employees in Seattle to just be a little bit more engaged, just lean forward in their chair a little bit more, care a little bit more about their work at Microsoft, work a little bit smarter, a little bit harder, and just go from being 70% engaged to 80% engaged, that boost of productivity and innovation and creativity would far outweigh any recruiting advantages. To me, it was just total light bulb going off that, higher level of employee engagement so that you can produce better outcomes. And you can do that through lots of ways. You obviously have to make sure that people feel fairly compensated. You have to make sure they feel part of a broader mission. You have to make sure they feel appreciated. You have to give them autonomy so that they can feel that they have an impact. There are lots of different ways that are company specific to drive employee engagement, but it absolutely drives different outcomes for companies. And Satya nailed it when he made that point to the rest of us.
I mean, and it's also kind of nice when you leave that company that you've recruited all those people who care as much about the company that you as a founder originally did. What's that like also to work on a product? You've created several companies where you've worked on them, built them from ground up, and then you leave them and kind of send them off into the world. And we as consumers still use many of the products that you created, and you're just kind of watching them from an outsider now.
It's a weird feeling. It's when I see a Hotwire commercial on TV, it's like I feel this sense of pride, but I haven't worked there in almost 20 years. And, I haven't worked at Zillow in 2 years. And when I hear somebody using Zillow or, I see a mention of it in the newspaper or wherever,
or at SNL, that,
yes,
that little spot.
I take enormous pride in that. And I'm sure I always will. The other point that you alluded to there is just, when you leave a company, frequently you want to keep working with people that you built things with in the past. And many of the people that I worked with at Hotwire went with me to Expedia once we sold the company. And then when we started Zillow, I think the first 30 or so employees at Zillow all came from Expedia together. And when we started Picasso, a lot of people came from Zillow to choose to work at Picasso. So, that's fun. It's fun having that continuity and working with people that challenge you and lift you up and that are great contributors through different companies at different stages. Actually, a couple of the people that we've hired at Picasso, I worked with at Hotwire 15 years earlier, and then we kind of all went our separate ways. And our head of product, as an example, at Picasso was an intern at Hotwire, 20 years earlier, and he went on to have an incredible career in tech. And then we hired him at Picasso. So it's fun to keep working with these types of people so many years later.
Well, that's even a great lesson in itself to always keep in touch with people you've worked with, because you never know where they'll resurface in a future business venture.
Yeah, well, and actually, I'm sure we'll talk about SPACs at some point, but my partner in my family of SPACs worked with me at Goldman Sachs in our first job out of college 20-something years, 24 years ago or whatever it was. So we kept in touch all these years and ended up reuniting to do SPACs together.
I want to talk about your love of Los Angeles for a second, because this is the Federation of Los Angeles. So you created this 75 and Sunny Labs, which I adore the name. It's obviously a nod to living in Los Angeles, where it's always 75 and sunny. You also started .LA, the LA Tech News Service. So clearly an LA fan, but there was a lot of focus several years ago on Silicon Beach. But then that hype kind of died down. Can you speak to the current LA tech scene? Is there one? Where does it stand today? And where do you see it in the future?
Yeah. There certainly is one. It's bigger than ever. I moved from New York to LA when I was 12, and almost overnight I fell in love with LA, and so it played a very important part of my growing up. And then I was gone for 20 years, from college to investment banking in New York, and then private equity in San Francisco, and then Seattle. And I lived in Seattle for 15 dreary years. And so, which, we're dreary from a weather standpoint. I like a lot of things about Seattle, but the weather is not one of them. And so when I moved back to LA about 4 years ago, I wasn't really sure what to expect. I mean, when I left 20 years earlier, it was a pretty one industry town. I mean, it was, when I was a kid, LA was Hollywood, and most people in the LA business community worked in and around the entertainment industry. And I was blown away when I came back to LA 4 years ago at how diverse the business climate is. There's real estate and private equity, and there are hedge funds, and there are technology companies. And of course, there's still Hollywood, but it is a very diverse economy. And with respect to tech in particular, I was incredibly impressed that there are many venture capital firms here, Graycroft, Anthos, M13, March Capital Partners, Upfront, Fifth Wall, Science, Idea Lab. I mean, I could go on. There are at least 30 to probably at least 50 venture capital firms in LA. And there are a lot of founders, and there are unicorns. And then the large tech companies in the Bay Area, like Google or Facebook, they have big presences here in LA. And of course, there are companies like Snapchat as well. And yet what was missing was journalism. There was nothing in LA that I could read to tell me about all these companies and all these founders and everything that was happening in LA tech. And Seattle had something called GeekWire. GeekWire.com is a tech news site that covers the Seattle tech ecosystem. And when I came to LA, I was just so impressed that LA tech was as big as Seattle tech in my mind, but there was no journalism. And so that's why my team and I started .LA, to shine a light on all the innovation that's happening here.
What do you see as the biggest industries being developed in Los Angeles? Do they have like a particular footprint, or are they across the board?
Yeah, so I mean, there is everything. There's B2B software as a service companies, and there's ad tech, and there's direct to consumer. But the thing that makes LA tech most special and interesting to me is the large number of startups that are at the intersection of media, entertainment, and pop culture. And Snapchat is sort of the obvious, the poster child of this as the largest in LA. But frankly, Netflix is another perfect example. Netflix, for all intents and purposes, is now headquartered in LA, not in Los Gatos, not really in San Francisco. By headcount, I think they have more people in LA than the Bay Area. Most of their executive suite is based in LA. Disney is a huge tech company. They have 100 million subscribers to Disney Plus, so it's impossible to describe Disney as anything except a tech company. And then, of course, at the earlier stage, there are lots and lots of startups that are at the intersection of media and entertainment and technology. And I remember when we first started .LA, I was talking with the folks at GeekWire, who actually invested in the seed round for .LA. And remember, GeekWire covers Seattle. And they were saying, they were so jealous. They're like, oh my gosh, you guys are so lucky at .LA. You're going to be able to cover stuff that is so interesting and so sexy. And, here at GeekWire, we're always covering like enterprise computing and cloud and all this hard tech stuff, but not the cool, like as an example, there's a company that I'm an angel investor in called Wave VR, which is based here in LA. And Wave is sort of avatars for virtual rock concerts. Riot Games and League of Legends is another, giant LA tech company. It's just, we have lots of interesting media, entertainment, tech, gaming type companies here that that Seattle just does not have, and even the Bay Area doesn't have as much of.
So it's got a little bit of that entertainment intersection.
Yes, exactly. In fact, little known fact, Jackie, the first name of .LA was going to be The Intersection, either the intersection.la or the intersection.com, because LA Tech is the intersection of media, entertainment, and pop culture. But at the last minute, the lawyers didn't think that the intersection would have enough trademark protection. And so we switched it to .LA. But yes, it is the intersection is the way. And actually later this week, there's a .LA event, a virtual conference called The Intersection, which is our, where we focus on exactly this. And now you know why it's called The Intersection.
So there you go. You can change like a byline to The Intersection, all the news that's fit to print, The Intersection. Okay, so you mentioned SPACs. So for those who are unfamiliar with a SPAC, which guilty I was, up until a week ago, it's a special purpose acquisition company that is essentially a shell company set up by investors to raise money through an IPO that eventually acquires another company. The Real Deal called you, I love this, a SPAC evangelist. So you are the SPAC guru, so to speak. Why are they so in vogue, even though they've been around for decades? And why are you now such a believer?
By the way, that was a good description of a SPAC. It's a
Thanks.
publicly traded shell company, and it looks for a private company to merge with. And SPACs have been around for a long time, as you say, but they were always kind of in the dark corners of the capital markets. They were not mainstream, and the reason for that is that high quality private companies weren't choosing to go public through these SPAC mergers. And that started changing a couple of years ago. There were several high profile SPAC mergers. DraftKings was one of the first, and then Virgin Galactic. And suddenly people started realizing that, hey, this is a way that high quality private companies can go public by merging with a SPAC. And fast forward to today, it's become much more accepted. In fact, most hot private companies are considering a SPAC merger as one of the three different ways that they could go public. They could go public through a traditional initial public offering, they can go public through a direct listing, or they can go public through a SPAC merger. The advantages of going public through a SPAC merger are several. Number one, it is a much faster process. It takes that private company weeks, maybe sometimes 1 or 2 months to go public through a SPAC merger versus over a year to go public traditionally. Number two, they get the sponsorship of the sponsor that has the SPAC. So in my case, my team and I that run these shell companies, we help that private company through that merger and as they go public. And so one way to think of it is, if you're a private company, you're going to either pay an investment bank money to take you public through an IPO, and you'll pay that investment bank in cash, or you can pay a SPAC to take you public through a merger, and you'll pay that SPAC in stock. And so these private company executives are saying to themselves, well, someone like Spencer has done this before. He's taken his company before. He's been on the boards of many companies that have gone from private to public. He and his team can help me and my team as we transition from private to public, which can be a difficult transition, and their experience would be valuable. And so they're going public through these SPAC mergers for the sponsorship that the SPAC provides. And then lastly, the private company is able to provide projections out a couple of years if they go public through a SPAC merger with no, their safe harbor, as it's known, meaning that they can provide those projections without having legal liability if they don't meet them. And if you go public in a traditional IPO, you can't do that. And so for these high growth companies that have very exciting stories to tell far out in the future, like flying taxi companies and spaceship companies and cannabis companies, these companies that have hockey stick type growth, they very much like SPAC mergers because they can issue those projections, and investors can get excited about the future potential of that company. If they go public in a traditional manner through an IPO, they can't issue those projections.
Are you concerned though about a SPAC bubble, because it seems like there's so much money flowing into it right now?
Yes, I am. There have been about 300 SPAC IPOs year to date. So a SPAC IPO is when the shell company goes public. Last week there were 3, and I think this week there are 0 or 1. So we've already dramatically slowed down new SPAC issuance. That's true. That's true. But many fewer SPACs are coming out now, and I think that's a good thing. Frankly, obviously, as someone who has several SPACs, it will be less competitive as we look for private companies to merge with. But more importantly, there were too many SPACs that went public over the last couple of years. There weren't too many good SPACs. There are a lot of kind of mediocre SPACs out there. But that's starting to change pretty quickly, as just the last couple of weeks has shown.
And then with the SPAC, because it does affect.
But I will say this, though, Becky. I do think that SPACs are here to stay, and I prefer to call them a sponsored IPO. A sponsored IPO is here to stay because I do think it has a lot of structural advantages over a traditional IPO. Just to give you a quick example, when Zillow went public in 2011, we went public at $20 a share. The stock opened at $36 a share. It peaked at $60 a share that day, and we closed at 40 something dollars a share. So we left a massive amount of money on the table by going public through traditional IPO. And that's one of the many downsides of a traditional IPO is that structurally they tend to be underpriced. And so you see these big pops on the IPO day. If you go public through a SPAC merger, that usually doesn't happen for a variety of technical reasons that we don't have to get into right now. So just another advantage of a SPAC IPO is that you tend not, the issuer, the private company tends not to leave money on the table. So for all these reasons, I do think that SPACs offer, or sponsored IPOs offer, a really good alternative way for private companies to go public. And I don't think that's going to go away. I think there'll be fewer of them than there were 6 or 12 or 18 months ago where it was all the rage. But I do think that they're here to stay overall.
So I'm going to give you a different nickname than the real deal, the SPAC Godfather. You know, as someone who has all this SPAC knowledge, you have your own SPACs. How would you advise a new company about, not going public too soon, but not waiting till it's too late, or, they're too big?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that private companies should think about when trying to decide when to go public. First of all, they just need public company readiness. So they need audited financials, they need a CFO, they need a general counsel, they just need blocking and tackling to be ready for the public markets. Number two, they need to understand the levers of their business, the if-then of their business. So in the case of Zillow, it was, if we spend $50 million on advertising, then our traffic will go up by 50 million visitors a month, and then this revenue will fall out as a result. That if then is very important. By contrast, when Facebook went public, about 60% of their usage was on mobile at the time, and they had never run a single ad on their mobile apps at the time of their IPO. And I don't know if you remember, but their IPO was kind of a disaster. Yeah. The stock traded way down, and it took about 2 or 3 years for it to recover. And they didn't have that if-then thing figured out. They actually should have waited a little bit longer until they had mobile monetization figured out. So that's very important for a company to have figured out before they go public. One of the reasons that companies are going public through SPACs more so now than before is it lets them go public a little bit earlier because of that projections thing that I explained. Right. And I actually think that's a good thing. I think that companies that go public earlier rather than later, it gives them access to the capital markets. It kind of brings forward their future, meaning that they're able to raise a larger amount of money than staying private, typically, not all the time, but typically at higher prices. So it's less dilutive to the early employees and the early investors. It's an important branding event and news-making event, and that generally is good for a lot of these consumer-facing businesses. And there's something about playing football on Sundays, not playing football on Saturdays. There's something about being public that makes everybody kind of stand a little taller, walk a little faster around the office, feel a little bit more pride of ownership. And back to the employee engagement topic, just it's big. It's the big leagues. It's game time. And I think that drives better performance overall. Of course, not every company is ready to be public, but those are some things to think.
Well, it seems like we're kind of positioning things really different in this new world, which I want to get to right now. I want to talk about COVID. I kind of call it the inevitable COVID conversation, but I like to think about people's attitudes with COVID. They fall on a spectrum. On the one side of this curve, you believe COVID was just a blip and we'll get back to normal. And then there's the other side of that curve where COVID changed everything and this is the new normal. Where do you fall on that bell curve?
Operate, it's changed everything forever, and will not, and we'll be going to sporting events again, for example, in person, not entirely online. We'll be going to conferences again in person, not entirely online. So those types of things will return to normal, but companies most companies are going to permanently change their perception of their employees' productivity when they're working remotely. And most companies are going to shift to a hybrid type model where employees can work anywhere they want a couple days a week, and they only need to be in the office from time to time. Not all companies, you can, a good mental framework is to think about when companies shifted from everyone having a private office in the 70s and 80s to open office space in the 90s and 2000s. Remember when all of a sudden, the Google campus and the Yahoo campus and, people are working out in the open, in open cubicles, open space. Not every company shifted to that. There were plenty of companies that stayed with just private offices, but most companies shifted to the open work plan, workspace model. I think that's what we'll see today. Most companies are going to shift to this hybrid model. And that has profound implications for commercial real estate, residential real estate, office real estate, productivity tools for companies. Companies are going to invest a lot more in software that makes their employees collaborate and feel more connected and engaged with their coworkers. And so there's tons of startup activity in this space. So anyway, lots of changes are going to permanently happen from companies shifting their perspective about remote work.
So how does that kind of fit into your focus on corporate culture? Can you still have the corporate culture in this new COVID half work from home? I mean, what if you never have a week where all your employees are in the same place?
Yeah, the answer is yes, you can, but it's hard. So Costa, for example, has 75 employees. We'll have probably 150 by the end of the year, and we have no office. Not just no headquarters, we have no office at all. Everybody is entirely remote. Most of us have never met.
Wow.
New employees start and it's entirely online. And we'll have our first ever all hands meeting with all 100 or so people in August in person. And for most employees, that'll be the first time they ever meet one another. So how do we maintain company culture in a completely hybrid environment? And the answer is it's hard, but not impossible. So you do, there's lots of little stuff that you do. You do weekly all hands meetings on Zoom. You do lots of optional activities. We had a painting class this week where at 5 o'clock on Wednesday, it was optional, but I think we had almost 100%, I guess last week, almost 100% attendance. We had a painting instructor come online, and we all painted the same painting, and everyone held it up, and it was fun. And everyone had, those that drank had a glass of wine, and it was a fun, casual way for people to get to know each other. We use Slack constantly to build corporate culture. We do a lot of employee recognition to try to create that. We send a lot of physical things to employees' houses. I know that sounds kind of odd, but trinkets from the company are littered on everyone's desk. Whether it be the little cards that show what the mission statement of the company is, or different tokens as we achieve company milestones, just as a way to build physical connectivity through tokens. So it's hard. It's hard, but if you're very intentional about it, it can be done.
Well, so you mentioned the businesses are converting to work from home and shifting to that kind of interaction more via computer. But where do you see tech's place in a world post-COVID for the consumer, or even for like schools? Do you think that is going to be something that the consumer who now switched over to Instacart is going to go back to the grocery store? Or is that going to be tech? You don't?
No, yeah. So the adoption of these on-demand services accelerated by like years. So on-demand grocery delivery, food delivery, online car buying, online home buying. One of my big innovations at Zillow was moving Zillow into the buying and selling of homes business, where Zillow, which will buy your house digitally and sell you a house digitally. And so whether it's Carvana or Get a Car or Vroom in car buying, or OfferPad or Zillow in house buying, or Instacart, Postmates, TaskRabbit, you name it, that is not going away. I believe that consumer behavior has shifted permanently to these vertical on-demand services. And as a tech investor and tech evangelist, I think that's a great thing. I think that's terrific that it's very similar to how 9/11, 20 years ago, accelerated the shift to online travel.
Right.
So, prior to 2001, every year there would be fewer travel agents from 1996 to 2001. During that 5 years, I think we went from 80,000 travel agents to 60,000. And then after 9/11, we went from 60,000 travel agents to like 10,000 travel agents. And people radically shifted their purchase behavior from offline buying travel on the phone with a travel agent to online purchasing of travel. And I think and that was permanent. Once you start buying airline tickets on Expedia or United.com, you don't go back. And I think once you start doing a lot of these other on-demand services post-COVID, you're not likely to go back.
Well, it's empowering the consumer, right? And that's what your companies tend to do, just democratizing things, giving everyday people control over things that were not previously accessible to them. Like you did that with Hotwire, information transparency when it came to travel, Zillow, information transparency in home pricing, your newest venture, OfferPad, it's direct to consumer home sale venue. Is that a personal mission of yours to always empower the user?
Absolutely. Well said. Yes. So democratize access to things that were previously only available to a few, whether it was industry participants, like in the case of Zillow, where only real estate agents had access to MLS data and access to county records, and or only travel agents had access to the secret database of flight times and hotel prices, and turn on the lights and empower consumers with that access to everything so that they can be on an equal playing field. That is absolutely the most common thread through everything that I've been involved in for the last 20 years.
But what is it about that? What do you want the consumer to feel? Because I mean, I do feel empowered when I, order my Amazon Prime. It's great, but why? What is the goal on your end of the thing?
It just seems right and fair. I guess that's that it's like leveling the playing field so that you or I have access to the same stuff, the same goodies. It just strikes me from a sense of fairness and propriety. Now, it's also good business. I mean, if you can do that in a big enough category, online travel, online real estate, then you'll be able to create a company that's very valuable. In the case of Picasso, it lets you buy a portion of a second home. So second home ownership is a perfect example where most people can't afford to own a second home, or if they could afford it, they decide not to because they think it won't make economic sense for them. And what Picasso enables somebody to do is they buy a portion of a second home. You can buy an eighth or a quarter or a half of a second home. And all of a sudden, it's much more democratized. We see people buying Picassos all over the country now that never previously were able to own a second home, and now they can because of this co-ownership concept that we've pioneered. And that feels good. That feels really good. As a founder involved in that company, I mean, when I get these letters or emails from owners that say, I just took my kids to my Picasso in Tahoe, and I never in my wildest dreams thought I would be able to afford a $2 million house in Tahoe or Napa. And it's because they can't afford a $2 million house, but they can afford an eighth of a $2 million house.
Right.
And as a result, they now can live a more enriched life by having access to something that they couldn't otherwise have access to. That just, I don't know, I get fired up about that, as you can probably tell. Yeah,
empowering the consumer, empowering yourself. I want to talk about your side gigs, which you have so many, but it has to do with your family, because this I love. You have a podcast with your 12-year-old son called Dad, I Have a Question, in addition to your other podcasts. So you discuss all sorts of topics with your son that you normally ask your dad. And then you're also building an app called Recon with your teenage daughter. So how did these ventures come to be, and what's it like working with your kids? I think we have some parents on here, so they're kind of wondering, how do you work when your coworker is your child?
So, I mean, the podcast with my son has been a ton of fun. We started it almost 3 years ago. We've had, I think, 60 or 70,000 downloads. So like a lot of people listen to it, kids and adults. And he asked me a question like, what is a SPAC, or how do mortgages work, or how do banks make money, or what is inflation? And the idea came from our household because he was always asking me these questions. And actually, my father-in-law was the one that suggested it a couple of years ago. He said, your explanation on whatever the topic, what is blockchain, and how does cryptocurrency and Bitcoin work? He's like, you should record that and make it a podcast. So that's been super fun. My other startup, which I haven't technically announced yet, but no, that's okay. It's fine. So it's Get Recon.
You do enough digging on the internet. I can find out kind of everything about you.
You are a good journalist, Jackie. Yes. So yeah, at getrecon.app, that's get RECON, like recon, like to reconnect, is a startup that I'm doing with my 16-year-old daughter. And we started this about 6 months ago, and it's live in the App Store right now, but it's behind a reg wall, so you need a user code to get access to it. But if anyone's interested, you can go to the website and you can sign up, and we'll get you a user code. But anyway, that's been a ton of fun, that project, and it's serving a real challenge, a real problem, which is social media's toxicity. And social media, I don't know about you, but my Instagram, my Facebook, my Snapchat, like it's just become a little bit exhausting. It's like either people living impossibly perfect lives that it makes people frequently feel bad about themselves, and it creates this kind of weird competition, or it is a very politicized, polarized situation where people are concerned about all the horrible things happening in the world. And at the end of a long day, that, either of those can not be that pleasant to interact with. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember when Facebook was fun, and when it was like baby pictures and dog pictures and just kind of like you kind of hanging out with friends online. Anyway, so Recon aims to solve this through exploring a shared love of food, which is something that is something most people can get excited about without becoming polarized. So what is it like doing this with my kids? It's fun. It's super fun. It can be a little awkward at times, but it's that's what it's all about. And this obviously is one of the Jewish values that is so important to our community. But teaching your kids and trying to make them better versions of yourself, that's kind of what it's all about.
Is entrepreneurship a life lesson that you want to pass down to your kids? Because I don't know too many teenage girls who are building apps with their dads.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. And I developed an interest in entrepreneurship from my dad, and I want my kids to develop an interest in entrepreneurship, which they all three of them already have expressed due to working with me. Like as an example, Sophia, my 16-year-old, she's in the Slack channel where my team and I discuss whether we should make investments in startups. And so we'll get a pitch from a startup. She's explicitly asked to stay in that Slack channel so she can learn. And so when my team and I are discussing in Slack, that pitch was good, that pitch was bad, the founder said this, we should invest in that. She's in that Slack channel learning from us, and she'll be a much better venture capitalist or entrepreneur someday than I ever could be, because she's learning it at such a young age. My wife, I think when our kids started to become, sentient, my wife, who's a doctor, and I both started this kind of competition to see, who would be able to inspire them to our career path. And I definitely have the first two won. I think the chances of them going to tech and entrepreneurship is very, very high rather than medicine. The third one, I think I'll also win, but she has some catching up to do.
Well, it certainly beats any extracurriculars that I ever did. So there are always some highs and lows when you're building something new, right? I like to call the lows teachable moments, though. So was there ever a point that you were challenged and overcame and learned a critical lesson that you can kind of leave us with in our last 3 minutes that we have you?
Yeah, we've talked a lot about successes and been very fortunate to have had a few, but I've had lots of failures too, Jackie. And there were many times, even at the successful companies, that they struggled. So in the case of Hotwire, 2 years into the business, we had 9/11, and 9/11 was a very difficult time for the company. We laid off a quarter of the company. We thought we were going to go out of business. It was a very dark time. And weirdly, 2 years after we started Zillow, in 2008, we also had the financial crisis, which was a real estate mortgage meltdown. So it seems like generally when I start a company, about 2 years into that company's life, there's a global calamity, right in the industry that my startup is working on. In both those cases, the hardest part by far was laying people off. And, both companies went from about 200 people to about 150 people. And that feels terrible. And making sure that you do that with empathy and as much fairness as possible, and that you then regroup with the remaining folks who need to move on and try to build the company back up, and make sure that you remotivate them and re-inspire them and reconnect with them. That's the most important thing. And we saw that through COVID, as so many companies downsized going through COVID. And yet there have been so many success stories coming out of COVID, and it's the companies that managed the downside well and then motivated their employees towards the recovery that are going to do great.
Okay, I don't want to reveal all my sources, but you were actually asked a question 3 years ago about predicting the next big crazy disaster if you were preparing for it at Zillow. And you were, I can't remember exactly, it was in my research, but you said, like, unless there's like some supernatural, crazy something that happens in the next 2 years, Zillow is prepared and the real estate market is going to be fine, blah, blah. But I watched that this morning, and I couldn't believe it, that you had kind of dropped that there would be like some sort of supernatural calamity that is possible. I just thought that was really, really funny.
Wow.
I just want to,
I don't know. That's amazing.
yeah, I just wanted one more question, if you can. What is the importance of also just giving back? I mean, you've had so much success, and, obviously you can open doors for people or pay it forward, but also help those people who are down and out. I mean, obviously we're with the Jewish Federation here, and helping the less fortunate is like so important when you experience that.
Yeah. And I mean, this is one of the Jewish values that's been very important in my life. And I've been involved in lots of different philanthropic things in terms of time and giving. All of us, everyone on this Zoom is in a position where we can give back. And I mean, everybody here has in their own way. It's critical. I mean, it's our responsibility, and it's just it has to be part of our nearly daily lives, because it's we are all so fortunate, and it's incumbent upon us to try to spread that as far as we can, and have a big impact on others. The things that I've focused on tend to be education, and my wife is focused on a lot of medical things. I was on the board of Seattle Children's Hospital for a very long time. We've been very involved in homelessness. So I mean, those are the issues that my wife and I are most focused on, are education, a variety of medical charities, and also homelessness. But it almost doesn't matter. It's like, choose whatever you are interested in, and have whatever as big an impact as you personally can. That's what we're here for.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly, you're preaching to the choir, I would say, right?
Yes. Obviously, this group has self-selected for that general attitude. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Spencer. I'm going to hand it back to Aaron. I'm not quite sure how this works on the Zoom, though.
No, thank you, Jackie and Spencer. Thank you guys both so much for being here. I actually think you guys probably could have gone on for another hour or two if we didn't have the hard stop, and I know everyone really enjoyed it. I thought the conversation about getting people excited about a mission bigger than yourselves actually resonates a lot with nonprofits, because that's what every nonprofit's trying to get people. And I know for everyone on this Zoom, that notion's why they're excited about Federation. So have a great night, everyone, and we look forward to hopefully seeing everyone in person soon. Thanks.